All right, I guess I think it's only right that I introduce myself again. My name is Chunbom. I'm currently a student at Yonsei, but I transferred from HDS, so I'm an HDS alumni, I guess. It's actually very nice to meet you all. It's actually kind of bad that I cannot meet you guys in person. If this was offline, I would definitely have approached every one of you to get to know you better. But unfortunately, we're during this pandemic. We cannot really do that. I hope we soon, thanks to our secretariat, we could meet offline at some sort of tournament that they're going to host for us. And I'll be waiting for that chance to meet you all. All right, just some clarifications before moving on to the lecture. Today's theme is BP strategy for beginners. So this strategy is strictly aimed for the beginners who don't really still have a sense of how to debate in BP format and what is so-called a strategy in BP specifically. So some of you might have debated in an AP format. Some of you might not have debated at all. I think this is a good chance for you to get to know and grasp the idea of how you can debate in BP, just like great show debaters who just showed you how to debate until just now. So I think this may be, I hope that this may be a great chance for you to learn BP in general. I would also like to stress that there are a lot of greater debaters or judges than I am, and I'm pretty sure your alumni in your respective societies would have their own resources to teach you and different know-hows or different understandings in debate. So do not accept this lecture as some kind of a direct answer to every debate, but do note that these are the tips that beginners can benefit from since you're going to be debating and joining us in our debating community for years now, hopefully. So I hope that's the takeaway that you can get out of this. Right. So let's start with brief introduction to British parliamentary debate. I'm assuming that your alumni has already taught you of what this BP looks like. I just want to stress, I'm not going to deal with the specifics. I'm assuming that you already know all the speaker positions, all the contribution and roles. But what I would just want to stress to you before I go on to the lecture is that in BP, it's not really about pure logic fight. Meaning, every debate is a logic fight, but this is not purely based on win or loss. Meaning, if there are only two teams, government and opposition, fighting against each other, it should be one team directly winning against the other. But BP, there are four teams. Therefore, the judging metric does not become direct win or loss, but it becomes a contribution. So what you should keep in mind during the lecture for the next 1 hour is that every single strategy that we're talking about in this lecture aims to maximize your contribution, not direct win or loss in this particular session. Having that in mind, let's move on. If you should have any question during the debate, during the lecture, please write it down in the chat box so that I can actually check and try to answer some of your questions that you're raising. I'm going to start with the opening half strategy. This is actually kind of the essence of how we're building an argumentation to begin with. Especially if this is an Asian parliamentary debate, this would be what debate is all about itself. But in terms of BP, this is about opening half strategy. Closing has different approaches to how to prepare the debate, but this is the PPT that you're seeing right now is a direct approach that you should use in order to strategize on how to do well as an opening half. The question you have to focus on is what is so distinctive about your world on a sketch? I'm going to tell you later on of how I understand the debate in general, but just to give you a preview is that every single team has their own white blank sketchbook that does not have any drawings or sketch on it. What you guys are doing in all respective teams is drawing the sketch and coloring your world about the motion according to your position. At the end of the debate, what you're doing is that you're going to draw and sketch your picture of the world, and then you're giving it to the judge. And the judge is going to think, oh, out of these four worlds, which world would I want to live the most? And whichever picture that gets chosen as the first preference will get the first ranking until fourth, unfortunately, a world that the judge does not want to live at the end. So I just want you to keep in mind that always in debate, what you need to think of, especially in BP, is to prove how and what is so distinctive about your world on your sketch at the point of which you hand in your sketchbook after you're done drawing. So that's the basis that you will have to remember. In today's lecture, we're going to focus on one specific motion that does not, I haven't seen this motion yet, but this is still a hot potato right now, and it's a very current issue that has raised a lot of controversies about how the government is spending money, if this is actually legitimate, if it has actually a practical impact, if it does, how much impact does it have? There are a lot of different questions raised, and there are a lot of criticisms, compliments on this particular motion. So the motion that we're going to focus today and be the basis of what I'm explaining in general is this house, as the South Korean government, would subsidize 2만 won, 20,000 won of telecommunication cost. This has been largely reported in the current news, and I reasonably expect that most of you already know about this issue. So based on this particular motion, I'm just going to deal with the opening half strategy in two main key respects. One is in terms of, on the left bottom, model construction, and second, in terms of case construction that you can see at the right bottom of the side. So we're going to talk about model construction first, how you can build a model effectively, as well as the second point on case construction, how you can build your principal cases and practicality cases more strongly, and what kind of questions you need to ask yourself in order to effectively raise questions, thereby getting the answer and using it for your arguments. Let's start with opening half model construction. In a model construction, you need to do two things. One is you need to clarify your model. And two, you need to mechanize the model that you have clarified. So let's talking about clarifying a model first. In this particular motion, this house is the South Korean government would subsidize 20,000 won of telecommunication cost. You need to clarify what this subsidizing 2만 won of telecommunication cost actually means. You need to start by defining some keywords that is in the motion. Meaning, what is the definition of, for example, universal subsidy? What is the definition of partial subsidy? What does it mean to subsidize anyways? Does that mean that you're actually paying partial fee directly to the telecommunication company on behalf of the citizens? Or does it mean that they're going to reimburse you for the telecommunication cost up to 20,000 won? And what is telecommunication cost anyways? How do you define the telecommunication? Are you going to give the money 2만 won per device, or are you going to give 2만 won for all the devices that individuals are using? You need to define some keywords that are located in the motion to make sure that you clarify your own understanding and your own model of what your stance and what your model is going to look like. The second step of clarifying your model is to talk about what kind of context am I trying to bring in to this debate. You need to ask yourself, why is this motion here in the first place? I'm also going to explain this later on in the lecture, but when the points that, when do we debate are only maybe two main cases. So we only debate in two major instances. One is when we're trying to solve a problem, or two, even if there's no very notable problem right now in the status quo, you're trying to making it better. In this particular case, and in all motions as well, if a motion is there, there must be a reason why the motion is there. There must be a background details that tells you why this is worth debating, therefore become a controversy at this point of the time. So what you need to ask yourself is that what is the context of this motion, and answer to yourself on the question of why is this the time to debate about this particular motion? What's the issue that we have to discuss right now? You also need to ask, what and who is the core issue in this debate? Because if this particular policy is the motion to debate, there must be some people or some entities who are directly or indirectly related to this particular issue. And they must have some kind of stake in terms of this motion. Therefore, they become a context in this particular debate. Just out of this lecture, this motion is brought upon by the fact that during this corona pandemic, people need financial subsidies. That's why a lot of subsidies other than this telecommunication cost, what we call is chan양지원금, also has been given out to all citizens who are able to apply. This is the same extension of welfare that the government is trying to push. That is a sample context that you can have as an understanding. Once you identified the context, what you need to now clarify is your stance and the position on this particular issue. The stance and positions are often the answers of the questions that are written here. What are we okay and not okay with, specifically regarding this policy? For example, if I am for subsidizing this 20,000 Korean won of telecommunication cost, the essence is not the fact that you are subsidizing it. The essence of this issue is how you are subsidizing it. Are you actually partially subsidizing the telecommunication cost? Is 20,000 won the maximum cap, or are you going to give 20,000 people to all citizens? The second issue is, are you giving this telecommunication cost to all citizens, or are you just going to selectively give this welfare to particular people who are really in need? You need to identify where your exact position stands. You need to identify who and how and why you're trying to implement this issue. If you're in the opposition, why and how you're specifically going to oppose this policy by brainstorming about your stance and position on this. You can go on with a hardline stance. If you're a government team, that you can universally subsidize 20,000 won of telecommunication costs to all citizens. Without exception, you're just going to go for it. That's also an option that if you're going to take a very hard stance. But in case you're taking a soft stance, you can just say, oh, we're going to selectively subsidize those people who are actually in need. That is a soft line stance that you leave out some exceptions in terms of who you're going to implement your policy to. I'm going to talk about this also later, but soft line stances tend to leave a lot of logical leaps that the other team can attack your logic. Therefore, it's going to be a wise strategy for you to stick to hardline policy if possible, but that only depends on how well you can build your own model to begin with. So let's dig in a little further now. The second step of constructing a model is called mechanization. Mechanization itself means that you're trying to visualize or show how this model is going to specifically operate. The questions you need to ask in order to mechanize your model are what's written on the PPT. You need to ask what you're doing with this model. Are you giving 20,000 won subsidy per phone, or are you going to subsidize multiple devices for a person? What is this specific policy about? But the second question you also need to ask is why. If you're going for universal subsidy over selective, you need to explain why is universal subsidy much better than the selective ones in detail in terms of how it's specifically going to impact people in two different cases. Why is universal subsidies impact necessarily greater than the impact that's coming from the selective subsidy? Are you going to partially subsidize the telecommunication cost and having the 20,000 won as a cap, or are you going to give out 20,000 won to all people regardless of how much they are paying for their telecommunication cost before this subsidy? You're also going to ask, why is this government necessarily subsidizing telecommunication costs, not any other living costs that individuals have? These are the key questions you need to answer. And just by answering these kind of questions, you're now mechanizing your model. Because what mechanization means is that you need to be able to draw a picture in the judge's head. Meaning, when judges have certain questions about why are you doing that? How are you going to do it? Who are you going to impact? Those questions must be answered for the judge to feel that you are mechanizing your model. These kind of strategies are pinpointed based on the guideline of what the judges are going to be curious of. Because ultimately, the judges are the ones who's giving you the win or loss or the rankings at the end. You want to persuade the judge. You want to win the judge. You don't want to win the debate. Winning the debate is not the ultimate purpose of a British parliamentary debate. Your essence is to win over the judge, over any other teams. And in order to do that, you need to make sure that you mechanize your model very tight and very nicely to make sure that you make sure that the judges can visualize what your model will actually look like. There's also the last question you need to ask is how, right? How are you going to secure the budget for these subsidies in the first place? Because no matter how many benefits you're going to give out, if it has no feasibility of being actually implemented, there is no benefit that's actually going to be actualized. Therefore, you need to talk about how those budgets are going to be secured, or what is your specific way of the subsidization to begin with, right? As I said earlier on, is it going to be reimbursement after citizens already pay for their fee, or is it going to be upfront payment from the government to the telecommunication companies, and then individuals have to pay the remaining fee only? There are a lot of explanation that judges are going to require from you in order to draw the picture of your own world. Because you're the one who's drawing the sketch and painting your picture, therefore presenting to the judge and persuading the judge that you need to live in my particular world, you should be the one who should be able to answer to three main questions of how, why, and what. I think these three question marks are the key for you to build a very, very tight model that you can actually run on. The next opening half strategy is based on case construction. It's not enough for you to simply build a case, because whatever you're offering, there must be some people who benefit from it, some harms arising from it, and you will have to argue it to the judge. Because note that every judge in English debate particularly have no biases, but are people who are willing to be persuaded on zero basis. Meaning, they're not going to make an intuitive logical bridge for you and draw the world for you. You're the one who has to persuade the judge and tell the judge, these are the explicit benefit that we're going to offer. These are the harms that you need to consider when judging this particular debate. Therefore, you need to be very keen in terms of how to construct a case when it comes to a motion. So let's look into the key question that you need to ask when building a case in this particular motion. The first question you need to ask is in terms of what is the ground principle that we want to push, right? There are a lot of different principles. There are countless number of principles that you can actually run. For example, you can run a principle called it's the government duty to actually care for these poor people who's suffering from this pandemic. Or you can also say, if you're going for universal welfare, we're standing for the equality in terms of provision of welfare. You can also oppose this motion under the principle of fairness, saying the rich are the ones who are going to be paying their taxes, which would be majorly used for this subsidy, which is given equally to all people. It's unfair for a certain portion of the citizens, therefore it's not justified. There are a lot of different ground principles that you can run. You need to think about what is the principle that I am willing to run in this particular motion when you want to build a principal case. The second question, once you decided on what kind of ground principle that you want to run, you need to ask, why is this particular ground principle that I selected is necessarily so important? Because there are a lot of principles out there, and every person can actually offer every single principle and say, therefore this is unjust, therefore this is wrong, therefore this is bad. The distinction of the level of persuasiveness here becomes how much significance you can give to the very ground principle that you're trying to uphold. You need to explain if, for example, if you want to say it's the government duty to protect people, secure the well-being of people during the pandemic by giving financial subsidies, you need to also explain why that government duty triumphs over any other principles that any other people might come up with. You also need to explain the importance of why that importance of the principle you're trying to push. And then the final question that you have to answer to be included in your principle case is, how does your model suit or contradict the ground principle that you initially proposed? The reason why I input contradict here is for the opposition. Opposition team will have to prove why the government team is necessarily contradicting their original principle by implementing the model, which is subsidizing 20,000 won of telecommunication costs right now. So there must be a principle exchange that are arising in the opening half from the both teams. There must be certain principle beliefs that are actually defending the motion or going against the motion. When you're done with principles, now it's turn for practicality, because no matter how high your moral high ground is, or no matter how strong your ground principle is, if there are no practical benefits, there will be no reason for the government to implement a policy anyways. Therefore, you will have to brainstorm. What are the harms and benefits that comes from this particular motion? For example, in this particular motion, the harm may be the government is wasting the money without necessarily getting any practical return anyways. It's like 20,000 won giving out to individuals when the amount summed up, like it's great money, they can use it elsewhere better. But on the individual level, the impact is very minimal. So it may be just wasting money. The benefit is that at least individuals would somehow benefit from that 20,000 won. Yes, it's maybe small money for some people, big money for some people, but it's actually going to benefit people because their expense is going to get lessened, right? Therefore, you need to list up these harms and benefits and try to take it to your own advantage and explain in comparison why your benefit or harm is necessarily greater than the other side is going to explain. The second question you want to ask is, who are these entities who are being affected by this particular motion? So this is also why your model construction is necessarily important. If you said that, oh, my model is that I'm going to universally subsidize all citizens of their telecommunication costs, obviously the entities that are affected by this may be the government because they spend the money, and ordinary citizens regardless of their wealth, age, and everything. These people are going to be affected. And last question you're going to ask is, how serious and important are those benefits and harms? Because I want to note to a rookie debater, since we're having a strategy lecture for beginners in particular, I want to stress that debate is oftentimes not about the number of arguments you have or the number of benefits and harms that you can argue. It's about how significant are your practical impacts and how practical are your arguments in this particular debate, not depending on how many benefits and harms that you can list up in a debate. You will have to explain to the judge that this benefit or this particular harm does necessarily stand. and it does have a practical impact when it comes to a real world. Therefore, me explaining one harm very, very thoroughly should be better than listing 10 or 12 benefits that are coming from the other side. The gravity, the weight of your contribution does not necessarily depend on the number of arguments. It's going to depend on how well you explain your impacts that are arising from these particular benefits and harms. So please keep that in mind when you're constructing your case. For opening half, for those people who have experience in AP, it's basically a very similar format of how you're actually going to construct a case, prepare on argumentation. But what BP really is, the reason why BP is kind of difficult is because you may be located in the closing and you will need a different strategy, which I'm going to explain further later in the lecture. Now, I just want to move on to the opening half's preparation time strategy, because when I was a rookie, or when I was giving a lot of lectures back in HDS to rookies, the most difficult thing that rookies suffered from is how to wisely spend the preparation time so that they do have enough argument to start the debate with. So here, these kind of guidelines may be very cliche, maybe too obvious for you, but these are the essence and these are the truths that all these very extremely experienced alumni, all these established debaters always keep in their mind. The first is to properly read and understand emotion. That's the basics for everything. When you're taking a test, when you're debating, whatever you're doing, you need to read properly and identify what is required from you. I think this is the very, very basis that most of you neglect at the end, because even in very, very big tournaments, a lot of established debaters who reach the grand finals, who will be the champions if they win that one last round, somehow read the motion the other way around. They prepare a wrong case, and then they just lose out, and they know that they don't have a chance in reversing the result. What I want rookie debaters to do is to properly understand the motion. When you're discussing with your teammates on what this motion is about, make sure that all of you understood the motion correctly and all of you have the same understanding. You guys are not on the same page. So that is the most important thing that I want to emphasize in the preparation time strategy. Second thing is that you're normally given 15 minutes in BP. You need to spend all that 15 minutes for doing two things. One is model construction. Through the guidelines that I have given to you just now, you need to ask necessary questions to yourself. And based on that, based on the model you have already constructed, you need to build cases on principle and practicality that the prime minister, or in the case of opposition, leader of opposition can argue. Because the first 15 minutes over, when you don't have any ideas that has been written down, the first speaker would have nothing to talk about. So the first 15 minutes, you can use that time for the first speaker's content. And then the rest of the speakers, there are only one more speaker for the team in BP. You can think of your own extension, or you can come up with rebuttals and extend it as an argument and use it in your speech as well. But please use 15 minutes to make sure that you do have a concrete model, as well as building a prime minister and leader of opposition's case. To help you do what I have explained so far on case construction, both in models and practicality, these are the core questions that you need to ask yourself. What is this debate particularly about? And what is our burden in this debate? When you're analyzing your own burdens, you can automatically analyze what the other team's burden as well. Because there are absolutely burdens that each team has to fulfill, and these are the question. These are the identifying the burden is a key element in terms of building your own model, because you know what kind of goal you will have to achieve at the end. There are 3 more questions in terms of principle building. Is there a principle we want to defend? That's the same as the finding and identifying a ground principle. The rest, 2 questions are about practicality, argument building. What are the impacts? Why is that impact a harm and benefit? How do those impacts happen? As I said earlier, explaining harms and benefit is not necessarily just about listing up harms and benefits. It's about how specifically are those harms and benefits going to be actualized, through what kind of specific mechanism, and who are going to be impacted by those harms and benefits. Please keep this question in mind and always try to ask yourself this question, try to answer it, and then use it in your case. This is the way to make your case very, very concrete. The last question to ask, what will the other side say? I would honestly say that in BP, for 15 minutes, it's very hard to reach the last question. It's very hard, realistically hard, because you don't really have enough time just to build your own case. But if you can, please think about what will the other side say, and how are you going to respond to the other side's stance. Thinking about these questions and answering these is the key to constructing a very solid model of your own. Let's just look into this a little bit more specifically. To set a model and set your own value that you want to push for, the questions you also need to ask is, what is the value that you want to achieve through this policy, right? Because this particular motion is extremely, extremely complicated. This motion can be analyzed in a political view. This can be analyzed in a societal view. It can be analyzed in a welfare kind of view. It can be analyzed at the individual view. It can be analyzed in many, many different levels. Therefore, depending on what kind of view you're trying to take and angle yourself in this particular debate, you can identify certain value that you want to push for that is in line with the view that you're choosing to do, and explain why that value is necessarily very, very important in this particular debate. And then the second question regarding the model construction is that, how does this subsidization model operate, and how will this particular policy help you achieve the value that you have identified for yourself? For example, if you say that, yes, we somehow know that a lot of these government expenditure on subsidizing telecommunication costs might not help a lot of people, but we're still willing to go for it because we prioritize the value of helping the poor who, during this COVID pandemic, who cannot even get a job, cannot afford their very minimal telecommunication cost. We believe telecommunication is part of the basic human right. Despite all those waste of money in other portions of population, we're still going to go for it by subsidizing 20,000 won. These kind of values that you identify in the debate shapes the very core principle that you're trying to push for. And without these principles, your case is going to be relatively really weak, and it opens up the vulnerability to the other team attacking your case by saying, oh, you're having a very wishy-washy stance. You're not going for A, but you're not going for B either. So we're not really sure what you're actually trying to do in this particular debate. You need to have a very clear stance to make sure that you stress your own position. You let the judge know that this is my value. Therefore, protecting this value is going to be the ultimate goal of ours. The second about case building, again, on principle, is about what is the belief or narrative that we want to protect. In this particular case, that there might be a lot of different beliefs and narratives that you want to protect. For example, in terms of subsidizing telecommunication costs, you want to say, regardless of any other factors, we prioritize protecting the poor people, making sure that they have a decent human right that's being preserved. That might be the value that the government is going for. But the opposition can also push for a narrative that since the government expenditure is always collected through the taxpayers' money, it is illegitimate for the government to simply subsidize people just based on their political interests. That this is a pure populism, that they spend the money to gain vote from poor people. There might be other principles that you can push for, but you need to set certain principles and values at in your model, and then you should continuously push for it in every debate that you engage in. In practicality, the same questions: what are the benefits and harms? And if any, what are the impacts they are trying to draw? Because the essence you need to remember is that you need to make sure that you explain thoroughly enough to the extent that the judges can visualize your benefits and harms, right? At the end, it's all about drawing a picture of the world that you're trying to portray to the judge. If the judge cannot draw the world only through your own explanation, there is no way you can do well in British parliamentary debate, as well as Asian parliamentary. Right, a little bit more of a practical aspect right now. So before and after a speech, there are 4 teams, right? You're only given one chance to speak in front of a judge. Since British parliamentary is judged based on contribution, not pure direct logic fight, you might have a question in terms of, oh, like, I'm an OG, I'm a prime minister, I'm a deputy prime minister already, exhausted my chance to make a speech, but the leader of opposition, deputy leader of opposition already is trying to deconstruct our case. How can I stress my own contribution further without having to make a speech? That is often the question that are asked by the newbies in debate. And the answer to it is that you need to raise a lot of point of information. Just now in a show debate that I also watched with you guys, there are a lot of point of information that debaters are raising. Those POIs are the key in making a further contribution other than your speech, to make sure that you let the judge know of your existence and your contribution. When you're in the opening, a little tip for you is that prioritize accepting closing half's POI rather than the opening, because closing half, I'm going to explain this later on, but closing half's biggest burden in their head is to make sure that their case must be unique, right? Therefore, if you expose the closing team's POI, if you accept closing half's POI, that POI is going to include some of the unique contents that closing half is having in their mind. They will not substantiate their case during a POI, but you can at least guess what the closing half is going to talk about through that POI during their speech. If you expose them, you have a better chance through your next speaker or the other team or your closing to make sure that they preempt or somehow neutralize the case that is coming from the closing half. Therefore, just a little tip for opening half: try to prioritize closing half's POI when you're choosing among the government or opposition bench when you're making a speech when they raise a POI. I don't know how well your alumni or samdaes have taught you about point of information should do, but a good POI should be able to take down the closing team's extension. This does not mean that 15 seconds POI would be enough in terms of tearing down the entire logic tower that closing half already built, but it should at least have it should at least serve as a neutralization factor of whatever contribution that the closing half is trying to take. Also, POI also serves as a function to rehash your team's points and explain why it outweighs, in comparison, closing teams' extension and rebuttals. Because judges are only human, right? They don't really remember, even if you gave very, very impactful speech as a prime minister. The debate usually lasts for an hour, and judges are only humans. The impact, even if it was very, very great from the very beginning, it doesn't really last. Therefore, you need to keep remind the judge of the impact you gave through raising a POI and rehashing your team's point that were necessarily and very, 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 very important. And of course, it's best if you can do both. Now we're going to move on to the closing half. But before we move on to the closing half, I'm just trying to accept some questions, if there was any.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So when you said that the opening has to prioritize accepting, the closing has POI, is it applicable to like the different, like if you're proposition, then oppositions POIs, not propositions POI?
Of course. So I think, yeah. So POIs you can only raise a POI. If you're a government, you can only raise the POI to the opposition team. So you cannot raise a POI to a person who's on the same bench.
So when you're taking down the closing team's extension, it's the other side's extension.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Right, any other question? You can type it in if you guys want. Am I too fast? Right. I'll have a separate Q&A session after the lecture. I just want to make sure that you guys can leave at 6. So I'm just kind of picking up my pace. But if you guys want to raise any question, you want me to slow down, just let me know through the chat, okay? Right, let's move on to the closing. I actually wanted to focus more on closing here because honestly, opening half strategy is pretty much common and obvious, and you guys already have a pretty much decent understanding of how to build an argument, what to explain. The only problem is that you guys just can't really, you know what to do, but you don't really know what to do. So it just depends on how, like how much you can practice. But for the closing, even when I was a rookie, I just had no clue what to do in closing. And I think this is the part where I suffer the most in my first 2 years of debate. So just want to focus a little bit more here. Unlike the opening half, I'm going to start the closing half strategy with prep time first, because this is also where newbies have the most difficult time knowing what to do and how to utilize 15 minutes. Right, let's look into it. Ironically, for closing half, I want to advise, it's not the answer. I want to repeat, I'm not a single answer to this debate, but my personal advice is that do not focus on building an argument if you're in closing. What I mean is that no matter how concrete your case is, it's very likely that your opening team would already have the same idea. Meaning, after you build a very concrete case, and then you now see your opening team repeat the same thing, you don't really have a unique argument then. So there's no point of you spending full 15 minutes building a model that is not unique. So I know this is a bit ironic, but do not focus on building an argument, but rather do two things that is below the first bullet point. The first is list up important stakeholders and value propositions regarding a particular motion. For example, in this particular motion, there are numerous stakeholders that you can think of. For example, you can say South Korean government, the ruling party, the opposing party, ordinary citizens, middle class, poor people, rich people, telecommunication companies. Listing up important stakeholders is important because one of the most definitive way for you to become unique, even if you compare to your opening, is for you to talk about a different stakeholder, right? If the opening already talked about how in the perspective of government and middle class, this policy is actually beneficial, you can frame your contribution the other way around and say in the view of rich and poor, why in general of all spectrum of citizens, it's actually a beneficial policy. As well as talk about the calculus of telecom companies, why this policy is necessarily harmonious with what telecom companies can do and how it can necessarily benefit our society at the end. Stakeholder analysis is one of the very tip that you can use to differentiate yourself from the opening. The second thing that I mentioned to list up, which is value proposition, is a bit of a vague term. So what I'm saying here is that it may not be just like value proposition per se, but it's something about, it can be political orientation. It can be certain belief in justice system. Let's look at some examples. Conservatives, liberal, some views on justice, principle on fairness, your belief in democracy. These are the value propositions that you can list up during the preparation time. What I mean is that the opening half would have exchanged their arguments based on certain principle that they have identified. What you can do after listing up the value propositions and after hearing the opening exchange, you can just simply cross out the value proposition that your opening half already talked about. And then you can build your case while listening to the opening half's speech based on those value propositions that has not been mentioned yet in the speech, to make sure that you let the judge know that your case is unique because you based your argument based on a unique value proposition that has not been mentioned yet. So that's the second thing that I want to mention in prep time. The last thing is to look for potential deadlocks and what can be the solution to those deadlocks. I think for me, the term deadlock was kind of a difficult term for me for the first 2 years because I get that it's a lock. I get that it's something that's not really solved easily, but I just didn't really get the idea of what a deadlock is and how to identify the deadlock in a debate. So let me just tell you the definition of the deadlock. It's a very simplified, my own version of the explanation, that a fight that is locked and unresolved due to compelling reasons that are clashing with each other. So there are a lot of different logic clashes that are not necessarily resolved because both sides are really, really compelling. In the judge's perspective, it can be that, it also can be that. So the judge cannot really decide which side is necessarily more persuasive. That's what we call a deadlock. What I mean by solvency is a third metric that resolves that compelling, stagnated deadlock that has not been solved in the opening exchange. We'll look at some examples. In this particular motion, there can be multiple potential deadlocks that might not be resolved after the opening half exchange. For example, there can be fight between conservatives and liberals because liberals argue that they they need to intervene in people's welfare. It's their prime interest to make sure that they give much welfare to people. I'm not sure if they're actually doing it properly, but at least that's what they're arguing. Conservatives don't really like that much of a change. They just want the system to be there without necessarily intervening. They're going to fight that regardless of how much the government is going to subsidize, it's going to be a fight between it's legitimate that they do, it's legitimate that they don't. There are going to be fight that might not be resolved properly after the open exchange. The second deadlock might be poor versus rich. That poor people saying, oh, the government has the duty to protect us. The rich saying, I'm the one who's paying a lot of taxes that you as a government use for your own expense. So I don't agree with you spending my whole shitload of money on supporting these people, which wouldn't necessarily yield that much of an impact. Third clash may be the legitimacy of the implementation. It's also in line with the procedural justice of how the government decided this policy and how they decided to implement it. There may be clashes on this particular legitimacy issue, as well as the fourth one of the result, because one of the most, I think, common deadlock is regarding the impact. Let's say we implemented this particular policy. Is there going to be a meaningful result out of it? If we subsidize 20,000 won for all people, are people's well-being going to be any better than the status quo, right? One side is going to say it's going to be better. The other side is going to say it's not going to be better. There are going to be deadlocks that would not necessarily be broken without a third metric. The last is the impact of the policy. Through the policy, is it going to be better or worse? Or are there going to be no change at all? These are the potential deadlocks that you can reasonably assume when you actually first see the motion. For the 15 minutes as a closing, do not try to build a very tight argument, very concrete argument, but try to, one, list up the stakeholders and value propositions that you can base your argument on. And second, look for potential deadlocks. And what could be the third metric that could solve this deadlock as a closing? This is actually a difficult part. Is there a question on this deadlock? Right, I assume no. Right, let's move on. Now, based on what I have explained earlier in the preparation time strategy on deadlocks, please keep this in mind because you will have to know this in order to understand the next 4 slides. What I'm now going to talk about is the differentiation strategy. This is my effort to give you a direct answer to a lot of beginners' question about what should I do to differentiate myself as a closing team? Because it's one of the most difficult thing that you can do. One of the most difficult thing for especially like beginners as well as very experienced people. Because we have hard time differentiating ourselves because opening teams, if they're really, really good, they want to take away all the contribution that can exist in the debate. So you will have to know certain tactics and strategy and certain approaches that you can differentiate yourself. I have 4 strategies. 1 is relevancy strategy. There's no official name for this. I just named all the strategies, so you guys feel free to use it, change it into your own name. It's up to you. Right, the definition. You can accuse the opening half as largely irrelevant from the essence of the debate. For example, if you're debating about this subsidizing telecommunication cost, the essence may be how the government should spend the money, or the essence may be how the government is going to provide much welfare to the poor and vulnerable people during this COVID pandemic. there may be multiple essence in the motion that is in fact relevant, but you want to accuse your opening half as irrelevant because you want to differentiate yourself. You want to stress that I have a very new important issue that I want to stress in this particular motion, and this issue is more relevant and significant compared to so-called relevant issue that has been raised by the opening half. That is what you want to do when you want to use relevancy strategy. This strategy is applicable in multiple situations, even in cases where the opening half were in fact relevant. You just want to frame them as irrelevant because you want to make sure that you are very, very unique and different from the opening. Assuming that both closing government and closing opposition did use relevancy strategy really, really well, this is going to result in the closing half win, because if you successfully frame the opening half as largely irrelevant or not necessarily contributing to the debate enough, fortunately, the closing half will be able to take the debate. Closing half win means either closing government or closing opposition gets first, and the remaining team gets second. Second strategy is what I call solution strategy. This is where my previous explanation of deadlock and solvency comes in. The definition of solution strategy is analyzing the opening half as a large deadlock that no one necessarily won any kind of discussion. Therefore, you saying as a closing government, suggesting a resolving metric that could solve the deadlock that is coming from the opening half. Therefore, in order to use this strategy, what you need to do is to clarify what the deadlock is in the opening. What was the deadlock about? And why did it become a deadlock? And why is it so important that someone solved this deadlock in the end? And what is the solution to it? If you can be the one who's suggesting that resolving metric to the judge will most definitely give the win to your team, assuming that you're CG. This likely win or loss the position is I just located arbitrarily on closing government. So this is applicable in all other teams as well, as long as you're closing half. But in this particular case, I just located in CG. The third strategy is what I named piggyback strategy. The definition is that you give your opening, not the other team opening. You give your opening. So if you're CG, you're giving OG the credit for setting up the debate and say, oh, we agree with what opening government has said. But we are going to substantiate and extend their case much, much further to prove some impacts that were not necessarily explained in the opening government. So what you're necessarily doing is that you're siding with your bench team, and then using their own setup, using their own principle, using their argument, and merely extending it much further, and tell the judge that yes, they did set all things up, but we were the ones who showed you the picture. You're trying to piggyback on the opening to make sure that you at least get your second rank. You at least get second. So what you should do is to extend opening's case, but you need to extend it noticeably further. Just don't stop at, oh, we agree with opening government. We suggest one more benefit. That's not enough for you to piggyback. What you need to do is to substantiate really, really well. And the way for you to do it is to visualize and analyze the impact in several levels. You need to analyze the impact of the government bench's case now in a societal level, individual level, systematic level, where you analyze multiple stakeholders that you're trying to impact. What you're doing necessarily is you're relying on your opening. But at least it's a good strategy if you cannot come up with an entirely different angle of approach. at least what you can do is to substantially extend your openings case. Assuming that you have done this properly and well, this is likely to result in either government bench win or opposition bench win. Since closing opposition can also implement the same strategy on their opening opposition. Last strategy is what I already kind of gave you as a preview, is a stakeholder strategy. The definition I would like to give on this strategy is that you can analyze the debate in a particular stakeholder's point of view. Oftentimes, when we start the debate, we just somehow analyze the debate in a very third-party perspective. So, for example, I think this is very common in feminism debate, that a lot of people just say, oh, you know, they suffer. Oh, you know, like they have been disenfranchised. But this is like a third party speaking. But good debaters, what they do is that they put themselves in the shoes of these women who are actually disenfranchised and provide specific stories. What is a specific mechanism that these women have been disenfranchised in the history? What are the specific realistic cases that we can actually empathize with? Putting yourself on a stakeholder's shoes, even if it's not feminism issue, like any other rich and poor gap issue or race issue of anything, is to explain in a specific context with psychological analysis why these people are suffering and why talking about these people's well-being is so important in winning this debate. Why talking about these people is necessarily the most, the biggest contribution in this particular debate. That's what you should do if you're trying to implement stakeholder strategy. So what you're doing essentially is that you put yourself in the stakeholder's shoes and you're defending them as if you're the one who is the stakeholder himself or herself or itself, and explain why giving attention to these particular stakeholders is so important. Assuming that you apply this strategy really well, I don't know about the second ranking, but you will get first ranking out of the 4 teams if you have done it really well in comparison to the other teams. If you successfully explain why defending this particular stakeholder that I'm defending right now is necessarily the most important contribution in the debate. So far I explained 4 different strategies that closing half can choose to implement. The reason why I want to stress these 4 different strategies, as well as the prep time explanation that I've given to you, is because I don't know if you haven't noticed, but prep time strategy is the basis for every single strategy that we're going over right now. If you have built an argument without necessarily listing up different stakeholders, different value propositions, different deadlocks and solvency, you wouldn't be able to know what kind of strategy you want to choose out of these 4. That's why if you're in a closing position, you don't simply start making an argument. You lay back a little, you think about this issue. Why is this issue so important? Why is this here? Who are the most important stakeholders? Who's getting affected by this? Why are we doing this? What might be the potential deadlock in the opening half? These are the questions that you have to ask yourself and your team, as well as coming up with an answer to those to make sure that you know how to differentiate yourself in the end. For the closing half, several tips for you to use during debate. Closing half normally have not enough time to build your own case, since the prep time is only 15 minutes, but the time you have to use is the speech time that opening half is using. So you have 30 more minutes for you to build your own case while listening to them. It's more difficult to build your own case while listening to the opening half's speeches, as well as at the same time thinking of rebuttals to give. But that's the best strategy that the closing can have. As long as you brainstormed different listings of value proposition, deadlocks, insolvency, and stakeholders, you will be able to build your own case while opening teams are making their speeches. I think practically, yours, Humbez, myself, alumni, I think we've all been having the same strategy on that. We haven't really been building an argument the first 15 minutes of the preparation time if you're in the closing. Right, during debate, what you should do. I think after each and every speaker in the opening half, you should summarize each speaker's speech into 2 or 3 sentences max. You don't necessarily have to write it down in full sentence form. You have to at least know the very essence of what each and every speaker argued. Therefore, what I do is that I write down around like 1 or 2, not quite full sentences of what each and every speaker has said, and try to analyze where I can differentiate myself. This is also linked to the 3rd bullet point, where it says you need to decide which strategy to use. We have gone over 4 different strategies in closing, and what I have written as deductive reasoning is that as you hear the opening team speech, you would already have prepared a listing of stakeholders, listing of potential deadlocks, listing of value proposition. You can just simply cross out the elements that opening half already talked about. And you can focus on what you have left that opening has not touched yet. And then you can decide what kind of strategy you can actually use in your own speech. The piggyback strategy that I have written here is quite a common strategy that we only use when, even after listing all value proposition, stakeholder, and everything, the opening has touched upon all those elements on my list. So if there is absolutely nothing that is left in my plate, that is when you need to go for a piggyback strategy. Yeah. I think this is quite the last substantial part of my lecture today in terms of how whips are supposed to make their speech in BP. The first bullet point is also kind of ironic because I think those people who have their experience in Asian parliamentary debating have been taught in a way that you should organize your speech by clashes. It is true, but the only difference here is that if you want to make a clash, you will have to make a countless number of them since you're doing multiple way comparisons. You're comparing your team's contribution to opening, for example, if you're CG, you're comparing to opening government, you're also comparing to opening opposition, you will also have to compare against closing opposition. Meaning, if you were to come up with logic clashes with every team that you want to compare against, there will be more than 9-10 clashes that you will have to cover. So what I prefer to do personally is that you identify a central issues, some key issues that most of the teams have touched upon, and then compare the responses coming from each team and prove why your team's contribution was necessarily greater than all the other teams. And that's the way that I personally prefer to construct my whip speech, as well as many other established debaters when you actually listen to their speech. Second thing that you have to keep in mind when you're whipping is that you have to re-emphasize your members extension, because this is one of the common mistakes that even established debaters have, is that for closing, there is only one speaker who can suggest constructive materials, meaning all the opening half speakers, from prime minister to deputy leader opposition, they can suggest they can suggest constructive materials. They can always suggest new materials, and they can bring it into the debate. But whip speakers cannot. Therefore, the only way for whip speakers to stress to the judge of your contribution in the debate is to keep re-emphasizing and extending your members' extension that already has been brought into the debate. So make sure that you continually quote on your teammate. Continually quote, like our member have already suggested. Based on what our member has suggested, you need to explicitly keep quoting your member and re-emphasizing what your team case was. And then your focus is to give a comparative against all other teams' contribution in a few central issues, why your team's members' contribution especially was necessarily much, much greater than all other teams. Last thing is for you to always keep in mind during debate, before debate, clarifying each team's position on each issue, because this is the only way that you can suggest comparatives at the end. If you cannot understand what is the core contribution coming from each team, you will not be able to suggest a comprehensive comparative in your own whip speech. When it is your role to do, when it's your role to fulfill, you simply cannot do it because you don't really understand, you don't really grasp the essence of what each team has said. Based on these 3 bullet point tips, you as a whip speaker should compare and contrast the 4 worlds: opening government's world, opening opposition's world, closing government's world, and closing opposition's world. This is how you make a whip speech in British parliamentary. Is there a question so far?
I have a question.
Yes.
When should you specifically use the stakeholder strategy? Because you talked about the feminism debate regarding this strategy, and since the closing half will be using this, do you use this strategy when the previous opening half used a argument regarding women suffering, or do you use it when they didn't talk about it at all and bring up specific mechanisms as a totally new argument?
Direct answer is that you use stakeholder strategy pretty much every time. I think this is the most convenient strategy that you can always use. But I think the answer to your question is that regardless of what your opening do, you always have other important stakeholders. For example, in feminism debate, women who are suffering is not the only stakeholder that we want to talk about. There are all other entities. For example, even within women, what we call is intersectionality. So even within women, there are pyramid of hierarchy. So there are white women who are at the very top of the hierarchy among women who suffers relatively less compared to, for example, Black women, not to be a racist. For example, that's just an example of a real debate that uses stakeholder strategy, right? So there are a lot of different stakeholders that you can identify. For example, in feminism debate, men is also a very important stakeholder, or government can also be a very important stakeholder. I think what you need to do is to identify if the opening has already talked about women who are suffering in general, you either can have a strategy, either one, to dig in further and identify who among those people suffering, who among those women are actually more important to talk about. So you can dig into those people who are suffering on the feminism issue and tell the judge that you actually identified who are the real people suffering among those women, when opening government is actually quite vague in terms of identifying who's actually suffering from that particular problem. That's one. Or two, you can choose other stakeholders' view. For example, men, or government, or transgenders, or LGBTQIA, who does not necessarily agree with this feminism agendas, and say why talking about these particular stakeholders is more important than simply addressing women who's arguing that they have suffered in the past. These are the simple strategies that you can use in feminism space.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
My name is Sensei Song and I'm from SNU. And first of all, your lecture was so much helpful. And
Could
my
you
first
speak up?
question, yeah, can you hear me? So my first question is about how can you share our thoughts on the models and the mechanization with our teammates? Because for the 15 minutes that we've got, I was always wondering how to put my time with my team members, because during my speech, it's impossible for me to share what I'm thinking with my teammates. So I think that during the prep time, there has to be so much points to be shared with my teammates, and I always wonder how senior debaters share their ideas with their teammates during the prep time. And the second is about the how to cope with collision of models in the opening side, because referring to the debate with that we've gone through today, there might be a collision, like whether a virtue can be a virtue is forcing people to follow virtue or not. I mean, so I was wondering how we should cope with the collision of models in the opening side.
Right, so let me check if I got your question right. The first is how you can effectively share your thoughts on model construction. Is that right?
Oh yeah, that's right.
Okay, and the second question is how do you deal with colliding models? Is that right?
To specify, I've learned that the prime minister, when prime minister set up the model, the other side has to follow up the basic assumptions of the prime minister. But I understand that the opening opposition can also propose a model of themselves, which may be different from the prime ministers. And what happens with all the arguments that opposition sides prepared if that happens? So how can the opposition side confront the model prime minister provided in their speech?
Right. All right. Let's deal with your first question first. How do we effectively share the discussion regarding model construction within the team? I think as long as you guys are assuming that you guys are in an environment that you guys are all either like physically together so that you can share your thoughts at a place. The effective way for you to do that is not necessarily based upon what kind of communication strategy you use, but it's rather on having your own list of questions that you're going to ask as soon as you ask your team and yourself, as soon as you see the motion. So you all need to be on the same page for example, as soon as we see the motion, you all need to think about, like, why is this motion? You all need to be on the same page that the first question you need to ask yourself is, why is this motion here? Why is this, what will be the likely model if this policy is implemented? and then you just share your thoughts, and you build a model that seems feasible, that also can satisfy your own goal and the value that you're pushing for. So if you're asking about communication strategy, I'm not sure. It's just like you're kind of like just talking to your teammates. But if you're talking about how to effectively come up with a model fast, since we already have 15 minutes, it's just through practice. You need to have a listing of questions in your head already before even looking at the motion. And as soon as the emotion is announced, you need to try to answer to the questions you already have in your mind with your teammates. You share the answers to each question very fast, very quickly with your teammates, and then settle with certain model, and then try to build all other elements of the model, add on interim model. I think that's how you do it. I'm not sure if I got your question right. And the second question about like government and opposition having a different model, therefore you don't know how the opposition can actually argue against the government team. Debate is, by its essence, all about comparing. So if you want to suggest a very different model compared to the government, you're free to do it, but you also need to engage in the government's model as well. So you need to properly suggest the reasonings behind you coming up with another model. You can suggest your counterfactual, you can suggest your counter model, but have to explain why the government's model is not either fair or dysfunctional, therefore give you the need of building a counter model, or giving you the need of explaining the counterfactual. Therefore, if there are two models that are clashing with each other, your solution to your best way to deal with it is to engage in both case scenario. Also explain why your model is feasible and nice, as well as also engaging to the other team why the government's model is either unfair or has a lot of harms. Therefore, it requires another model to be presented. Did I answer your question properly?
Sure. Thank you for your answer.
All right. Any other questions?
I have two questions, if I can continue. It's gonna be brief. So the first question I have is basically on how BP ranking works, because I do understand that they are ranked from first to fourth, but before that, the judge often gives the win to a certain side or gives the win to the opening or the closing half. So I was just wondering whether it's totally up to the judge's decision to announce the win of the opening or closing half or the win of a certain side. And my second question is that in BP, whether our speakers also judged based on the POIs they ask, because earlier throughout your lecture, you mentioned the tip for the opening half of how they should prioritize POIs from closing halves. Then it kind of came to my mind that isn't it better for them than for the closing halves to not ask POIs to the opening halves, or for them to just ask light POIs that do not reveal their unique ideas? So I just wanted to ask, are speakers also judged based on the POIs they ask?
Right. I'll be brief in terms of answering these questions. First of all, how is ranking decided? It's entirely up to the judge. I think KIDA Secretariat will also hold a separate adjudication workshops to educate all of you, as well if you guys want also to be a judge, on how specifically the judging works. And you're going to be taught of certain rules that judges would have to follow to decide the rankings of each team. So the reason why judges say, oh, I gave the win to up bench, I gave the win short diagonal, I gave the win to long diagonal, government bench, opposition bench, opening half, closing half, it's just one of the way of explaining the half of the teams who got in the first and second ranking. But that's not really the essence. What judges do first when they're judging a round is they decide on 4 rankings. So who gets first, who gets second, who gets third, and who gets fourth. And then depending on where the first and second are located, they just call it either long diagonal, short diagonal, up bench, off bench, opening half, closing half. That's just the way they call it. It's not really how they decide who wins in a macro scale first, and then deciding like who wins over the other, who wins over the other. It's what first to fourth first, and then they just it's one of the way they express their judgment. So I think that's how you can understand how the judging works. The second question was about POI. Why would closing raise a POI if the opposite opening knows that they want to expose the closing? If you actually engage in a debate as a closing, you also have a limited chance of allowing the judge to know what your contribution is. Yes, it's strategically advantageous for closing to minimize your exposure to the opening, since opening will have a chance to preempt you of your contribution. But one, opening not always do a great job in terms of preempting your case. And two, there are a lot of ways that closing teams can also hide your own unique ideas while attacking the logic of the opening just on the logic itself. So if you have, so it's discouraged for the closing to, I don't know, like imply your argument in a POI while raising a POI to the opening. But as long as closing teams purely attack the logic of the opening half without implying your own unique contribution, you wouldn't necessarily have to discourage yourself from raising the POI.
Okay, thank you for the answer and for a great lecture today.
All right, thank you. Any other person?
Yeah.
Right. Those people who have more questions, I think you can ask me after, because I just have 2 more minutes to wrap up this lecture. Right. This part is not necessarily directly related to BP strategy per se, but this is just to let you know about this community and when, why, and how these active members in debate community actually debate. Because since you joined your respective societies, you're now part of this group called KIDA. And we have more than 1,800 members so far in our history, with more than 160 plus active members with more than 14 institutions. I just want you to know that like why specifically these people, more than like 1,800 people are really, really active in this debate scene. And I think I just want to stress that after 1 or 2 semesters with us, hopefully if we can meet up, that's going to be better. But through your debating experience, I just want you to give some expectations what you can get as a takeaway in this community. I think the biggest takeaway for me as well is that I think I got a lot of different chances to challenge myself in terms of thinking outside the box, because there are going to be a lot of different notions that you're going to never ever think about if you're not put in a position of debating against each other, when you don't even get this control over which side of the position that you're willing to take, right? Even if there are some certain motions that you do not want to defend, certain motions that you want to defend, you will not have any control over which side you want to defend, which means that you will be forced into brainstorming what are the logical bases for certain beliefs that I might not believe in. And these are the experiences that I think empowers and makes us all grow in this community. And that's why I believe that, including myself, who have been, I think in this community, have been active in this community for more than, I think, 3 years now, that it's your biggest takeaway in this community. I think the way you should debate in KIDA is that this is like a COVID pandemic and we cannot really meet up. but we used to be a society. We used to be a community who always meet up. During the debate, we fiercely debate. We challenge ourselves. But after the debate, we act like as if nothing happened. And we gather around. We drink a lot. We communicate with each other. We become friends. I think it was a great community that we have formed. So what I just want to say in the closing remarks is that I really hope you guys get a lot from this community, not only in terms of how you can learn a lot in terms of logic, how you can think outside the box and everything, but as well also, hopefully, if this COVID pandemic goes away very soon, you can also earn a lot of friends, very respectable people, and gain a lot of aspirations and inspiration from this community, from the great secretariats and all other people who are really committed to this community. And as a last remark, I really hope that I meet you guys all very soon, if there are any other chances that we can see offline. I think, yeah, that's all I want to say. Please be a part of this very active and passionate community yourself. And I really hope that I don't know if this really were much of a help, but really hope that you have learned something today through my lecture. I think that'll be it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chumbom, for the lecture. I'm pretty sure everyone had a very interesting take on BP strategy, and hopefully they will have a better understanding of BP debate at the end. So yes, a couple of announcements. First, we are going to be uploading the material that we used for the orientation, as well as the material for Chumbom's lecture on our Facebook page. So please check that out at KIDA Secretariat. Second, we are also going to be editing the orientation and the open house debate and the lecture, and we're going to be posting that on our official YouTube channel. So if any of you want to listen to Chumbom's lecture again, or if you want to listen to the speeches that you've heard today, that would also be very, very great. Yes, and then also just a reminder to, I guess, everyone to sign up for our event. I think people are waiting until this workshop ended, and at this point, basically, if you just share it, you are probably guaranteed a gift. So please just check that out, and that would be great. Yes, also reminder for society heads, tomorrow's KCM. Let's all see you there. Thank you again, Chumbom, so much for that lecture, and thank you again to all the show debaters that came today. It was a truly great experience meeting you guys virtually, and as Chumbom said before, we really hope that we have a chance to meet each other face to face. And until then, please stay safe and healthy, and we will see you next time. Thank you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to be ending the meeting very soon. And Chumbom, thank you again for that lecture.